Pope Leo XIV walked through the marble corridors of the Vatican that evening, his white cassock flowing behind him like a ghost of centuries past, and for the first time in months he felt the crushing weight of his sacred office pressing down on his shoulders like lead. But what happened next would change everything, not just for him, but for a family thousands of miles away in Texas who had no idea their prayers were about to be answered in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Like an endless parade of ceremonies, audiences and benedictions had drained something essential from his soul, leaving him yearning for a single moment of genuine human connection beyond the choreographed reverence that surrounded him every waking hour. His footsteps echoed softly against the ancient stone floors as he moved through the dimly lit hallways, each sound a reminder of his solitude within these sacred walls. The day had been particularly grueling, filled with back-to-back meetings with cardinals discussing theological matters that seemed to grow more abstract and distant from real human suffering with each passing hour. He'd blessed countless rosaries, offered papal audiences to dignitaries who spoke in careful, measured tones, and presided over ceremonies where every gesture had been rehearsed and every word predetermined. His face ached from the constant smile, his hand cramped from endless blessings, and his heart felt hollow from the ritualized interactions that had replaced spontaneous human warmth. Leo paused at a tall window overlooking St. Peter's Square, now empty, except for the gentle glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Beyond the square, the world sprawled in all directions, filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives, sharing meals with their families, arguing about football, laughing at simple jokes, experiencing the messy, beautiful reality of human existence that felt increasingly foreign to him. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, watching his breath fog the surface momentarily before disappearing. The Swiss guards stationed throughout the corridors maintained their respectful distance, their presence a constant reminder of his elevated status and the invisible barriers that separated him from the world beyond these walls. Even his closest advisors approached him with a mixture of reverence and caution that made genuine conversation nearly impossible. When had he last heard someone speak to him without first calculating the theological or political implications of their words? A rebellious thought began to form in his mind, something that would have shocked his predecessors and certainly his security detail. What if just this once he simply walked out, not for an official papal visit with motorcades and crowds, but alone, as just another man seeking a quiet meal and perhaps a moment of authentic human connection in a world that stretched far beyond these marble walls? The thought crystallized as Leo retreated to his private study, the same room where popes had wrestled with decisions that shaped nations and souls for centuries. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls, their gilded spines catching the lamplight, like golden prayers. But tonight, their ancient wisdom felt inadequate for the yearning that burned in his chest. Through the tall windows, St. Peter's Square lay empty and peaceful, the cobblestones gleaming under the soft illumination of street lamps. Leo moved to his desk, fingers tracing the smooth surface where countless papal signatures had sealed documents of faith and diplomacy. But what he contemplated now was neither theological nor political. It was profoundly human. The idea of simply disappearing even briefly into the anonymous embrace of ordinary life sent electricity through his veins. Soft knock interrupted his reverie. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Vasquez's voice carried through the heavy wooden door, respectful but concerned. "Your evening prayers?" "In a moment, Cardinal," Leo replied, his voice steadier than his racing heart. He listened to Vasquez's retreating footsteps, each sound a reminder of the protocols and expectations that governed every breath he took. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, considered by millions to be God's representative on earth, yet feeling more spiritually isolated than he'd ever been as a simple parish priest. Leo opened the bottom drawer of his desk, revealing the simple black cassock and white collar he'd worn during his seminary days. The fabric felt different beneath his fingers, rougher, more honest somehow than the silk and gold that now adorned his daily existence. This humble garment represented who he'd been before the weight of the papacy had transformed him into a symbol rather than a man. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cassock from the drawer. The decision was crystallizing with each heartbeat, moving from impossible fantasy to inevitable reality. Somewhere out there, beyond the Vatican walls, beyond the protocols and ceremonies, people were living authentic lives, sharing meals, telling stories, creating connections that didn't require genuflection or careful theological consideration. The cassock felt like possibility in his hands, like freedom woven into simple black cloth. Tomorrow's schedule flashed through his mind. More audiences, more ceremonies, more carefully orchestrated moments of spiritual leadership that somehow left his own spirit parched and yearning. Tonight, he decided, would be different. The papal jet's engines hummed beneath Leo's feet as he stared through the small window at the endless expanse of Atlantic Ocean below, his simple black cassock feeling both liberating and terrifying against his skin. He'd told only Cardinal Vasquez that he needed a brief pastoral journey to America, leaving the details deliberately vague. And now, 35,000 feet above the earth, the magnitude of his deception settled over him like a weight he'd chosen to carry. Father Martinez, his trusted secretary, sat across the narrow aisle, reviewing what he believed to be official papal correspondence, his weathered hands moving efficiently through documents that would normally require Leo's immediate attention. The elderly priest had served 3 popes with unwavering devotion, and Leo felt a stab of guilt for the carefully constructed half-truths that had brought them both aboard this aircraft bound for Dallas. "Your Holiness," Father Martinez said. Softly, glancing up from his papers, the Archdiocese in Dallas has prepared a full schedule of appearances. Cardinal Morrison is particularly excited about the university blessing ceremony. Leo's stomach tightened. There would be no ceremony, no official appearances, no carefully orchestrated papal events. Instead, he planned to slip away from Father Martinez at the airport, disappear into the anonymous sprawl of American suburbia like a stone dropped into deep water. "Father," Leo said carefully, his voice barely audible over the engines, "I may need some time for private reflection during this visit. Personal prayer, away from the scheduled events." The older priest's eyes softened with understanding. "Of course, Holy Father, the burden of your office requires spiritual sustenance. I'll ensure your privacy is protected." The irony of Father Martinez's gentle concern made Leo's chest ache. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to serving the papal office, who viewed every moment of Leo's existence as sacred duty, and Leo was about to abandon him in a foreign airport to pursue what might seem like the most selfish impulse imaginable. As the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Leo felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the window, the Texas landscape spread below them like a patchwork quilt. Endless highways threading between shopping centers and suburban developments, a world as foreign to his Vatican existence as another planet. The landing gear engaged, with a mechanical thud that seemed to echo through Leo's entire being. Soon he would step onto American soil, not as Pope Leo XV arriving for a state visit, but as a lonely man in search of something he couldn't quite name. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and Leo's transformation began. The taxi dropped. Leo on a street corner in downtown Dallas as the sun melted into the Texas horizon, painting the glass towers in shades of amber and rose that reminded him of the stained glass in St. Peter's Basilica. But here, instead of centuries-old stone and sacred silence, the air thrummed with car engines, distant music, and the indefinable energy of a city that never quite settled into evening prayer. Leo walked slowly along the sidewalk, his simple, black cassock drawing occasional curious glances from passers-by, who saw only another priest making his evening rounds. The anonymity felt intoxicating after years of being recognized in every corner of the globe. A businessman brushed past him without a second look, a jogger nodded politely, and a young mother pushing a stroller offered a brief smile that held no trace of reverence or ceremony, just ordinary human acknowledgement. The escape from the airport had been surprisingly simple. While Father Martinez coordinated with local church officials in the arrival lounge, Leo had slipped away through a side exit, his heart pounding with the thrill of successful rebellion. Now, 3 hours later, he wandered through streets that felt as foreign as the surface of Mars, yet somehow more real than the marble corridors he'd left behind. His stomach growled with genuine hunger, not the polite appetite that arrived precisely at mealtimes in the Vatican, but the deep, honest hunger of a man who had walked for hours without thought of protocol or schedule. The aroma of barbecue and grilled meat drifted from various establishments, mixing with car exhaust and the sweet scent of blooming magnolia trees. Then, turning down a side street lined with brick buildings that spoke of decades rather than centuries, something caught his attention, tucked between a pawn shop with barred windows and a small convenience store advertising lottery tickets in multiple languages. Leo discovered a restaurant that seemed to exist outside the gleaming corporate landscape of downtown Dallas. The wooden sign above the entrance was weathered but proud, reading Cattleman's Pride in faded gold letters, with smaller text beneath announcing family-owned since 1952. Warm light spilled from the windows onto the cracked sidewalk, and through the glass Leo could see the glow of red vinyl booths and the shadows of people sharing meals in the comfortable disorder of authentic conversation. This wasn't the kind of establishment that catered to tourists or business dinners. There were no valet stations, no maitre de podium, no polished surfaces that gleamed under expensive lighting. Instead, it possessed the unpretentious charm of a place that had been feeding the same neighborhood for generations. Leo paused on the sidewalk, his hand instinctively moving to the simple wooden cross beneath his collar, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. The brass bell above the door chimed softly as Leo stepped inside, and immediately the warm aroma of seared beef, smoky mesquite, and caramelized onions enveloped him like an embrace from a world he'd forgotten existed. The restaurant was smaller than it had appeared from the street, with perhaps a dozen red vinyl booths, walls adorned with mounted longhorn skulls and faded photographs of local ranchers, and the comfortable patina of decades spent serving honest food to working people. A woman in her 60s looked up from behind the hostess station, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her weathered hands pausing mid-motion as she reached for a menu. For a moment, time seemed suspended in the amber glow of the restaurant's lighting, the gentle sizzle from the kitchen creating a soundtrack for recognition dawning slowly across her face. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, her voice carrying the musical cadence of East Texas, her dark eyes widening as she processed what she was seeing. Behind her, through the service window that connected the dining room to the kitchen, Leo could see a younger man, her son, perhaps, straightening from where he'd been tending the grill, his spatula frozen mid-flip as his gaze found Leo standing, uncertainly in the doorway, The conversations at nearby tables began to fade as heads turned, forks pausing halfway to mouths, glasses of sweet tea suspended in mid-sip. An elderly couple at the corner booth leaned forward, squinting through wire-rimmed glasses. A family with 2 young children stopped their dinner entirely, the parents exchanging glances that spoke of shared disbelief. "Good evening," Leo said, softly, his voice barely above a whisper, unsure whether he should acknowledge the obvious or pretend that nothing unusual was happening. The simple greeting seemed to break the spell, and suddenly everyone was moving at once, though with the careful deliberation of people afraid that sudden motion might shatter whatever miracle had just walked through their door. The hostess, Dolores, according to her name tag, wiped her hands quickly on her apron and stepped around the station, her movements surprisingly graceful for someone who had clearly spent decades on her feet. "Santo cielo," she breathed, then caught herself, as if realizing that using Spanish might somehow be inappropriate for addressing the leader of the Catholic Church. "Please," Leo said gently, raising his hand in a gesture that was both blessing and plea. "Tonight I am simply Father Leo, if that would be acceptable." Dolores's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, and Leo could see her struggling between the impulse to kneel and the more natural desire to welcome a hungry stranger into her restaurant. The silence stretched for another heartbeat, filled with the weight of impossible recognition and the fragile hope of ordinary connection. Then she made her choice. "Then welcome, Father Leo," Dolores said, her voice thick with emotion and the warmth of genuine hospitality. "I'm Dolores Martinez, and this is my family's place." Her eyes darted briefly toward the corner where a small wooden crucifix hung above a faded photograph of Pope John Paul II, as if seeking guidance on how to navigate this unprecedented moment. But instead of genuflecting or reciting formal prayers, Dolores did something far more extraordinary. She reached out and touched Leo's arm with the gentle familiarity of a mother, checking if her son had been eating properly. "You look tired, Father," she said, her maternal instincts overriding centuries of papal protocol. "When did you last have a proper meal?" The question was so unexpected, so wonderfully normal, that Leo felt his shoulders relax for the first time since entering the restaurant. Behind the service counter, her son, Tommy, Leo would learn, cleared his throat nervously and shot his mother, a look that clearly said, "Mama, you can't just tell the Pope he looks tired." But Dolores ignored him completely, taking Leo's elbow with the steady assurance of someone accustomed to caring for others without ceremony or self-consciousness. "Tommy, set up the corner booth properly," she called over her shoulder. "Rosa, bring some of that fresh cornbread from the kitchen. And you," she turned back to Leo with a firmness that brooked no argument, "you sit down and let me feed you." "Right." The family at the nearby table continued to stare with barely concealed amazement, their own dinners forgotten as they witnessed this extraordinary scene. Their teenage daughter pulled out her phone, then hesitated, looking to her parents for guidance about whether photographing the Pope eating dinner was appropriate or sacrilegious. Leo allowed Dolores to guide him to the corner booth, marveling at how easily she'd taken charge of the situation. Her hand on his elbow was steady and sure, the touch of someone who had spent decades making strangers feel at home. As she gestured for him to sit, wiping down the red vinyl seat with practiced efficiency, Leo realized that something remarkable was happening. For the first time in years, someone was mothering him. "Now then," Dolores said, settling into the booth across from him without asking permission, a gesture so natural and presumptuous that it made Leo's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Before we talk about food, I need to know, are you really here? Or am I having one of those dreams where I wake up disappointed?" The honesty of her question, delivered with the directness that seemed to characterize everything about this remarkable woman, made Leo smile genuinely for the first time in months. "I'm really here, Mrs. Martinez," he said softly, "and I'm very hungry." The ribeye that Tommy brought from the kitchen was perfectly seared, its edges caramelized to a deep brown that spoke of decades of experience with flame and timing. Leo cut into the meat, savoring the way the juices ran pink across the white plate, a simple pleasure that somehow felt more sacred than the elaborate ceremonial meals he'd grown accustomed to in Vatican dining halls. "My grandfather started this place in 1952, Dolores said, her weathered hands folded on the red Formica table. "Came up from Mexico with nothing but recipes his mother had taught him and a dream of feeding people good, honest food." She gestured toward the faded photographs lining the walls, black and white images of a younger man in a white apron, standing proudly beside a much smaller version of the current restaurant. Tommy approached their table carrying his own plate, his movements tentative as he glanced between his mother and Leo. "Mama said I should eat with you," he said, his voice carrying the slight embarrassment of a grown man still taking direction from his mother. If that's okay with you, Father." "Please," Leo said, gesturing to the empty space beside Dolores. "I'd be honored." As Tommy settled into the booth, Leo noticed the calloused hands that spoke of years spent over hot grills, the careful way he arranged his silverware, the pride mixed with exhaustion in his dark eyes. This was a man who had inherited not just a restaurant, but the weight of family expectations and tradition. "Tell me about those recipes," Leo said, genuinely curious about the history that had created the extraordinary meal before him. Dolores's face brightened, and for the next 20 minutes, Leo found himself immersed in stories of family gatherings, of secret spice blends passed down through whispered conversations, of customers who had become extended family over the decades. Rosa, Tommy's teenage daughter, emerged from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of sweet tea, her young face serious as she listened to her grandmother's tales. But as the evening deepened, Leo noticed the shadows that crossed their faces when the conversation turned to the future. Tommy's glances toward the cash register, Dolores's careful calculation of portions, Rosa's gentle question about whether they could still afford her college applications. "The neighborhood's changing," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of dreams deferred. "Property values going up, rent doubled in the last 2 years. We're barely making it month to month now." Dolores reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "We'll find a way, mijo. We always do." But Leo could see the fear beneath her determined smile, the particular terror of watching everything your family had built slowly slip away, despite your best efforts. "Show him the plans, Rosa," Dolores said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and resignation that made Leo's chest tighten. The teenager disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying a worn manila folder, its edges soft with handling, pages threatening to spill from years of hopeful additions and careful revisions. Rosa spread the contents across the red Formica table with the reverence of someone unveiling sacred relics. Hand-drawn sketches showed an expanded dining room, detailed measurements for additional seating, even rough calculations for a small outdoor patio that could accommodate the warm Texas evenings. Each page bore the marks of different family members, Dolores's careful handwriting, noting customer capacity, Tommy's practical sketches of kitchen equipment, Rosa's artistic renderings of a renovated facade. "We always dreamed of expanding into the space next door," Tommy said, his voice gaining strength as he pointed to the detailed plans. "The old barber shop's been empty for 2 years now. We could double our seating, maybe add a small banquet room for quinceañeras and wedding receptions. The community needs a place like that." Leo studied the sketches, seeing not just architectural plans, but the crystallized hopes of 3 generations. Rosa had drawn small details that spoke of deep love for this place, Flower boxes beneath the windows, a hand-painted sign welcoming customers in both English and Spanish, even a small shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe beside the entrance. "Rosa wants to study business in college," Dolores said, her weathered hand resting gently on her granddaughter's shoulder. "She has ideas for catering, maybe even a food truck to serve the construction sites downtown. Smart girl, smarter than her old abuela. But the lease on the barbershop would cost more than we make in 6 months," Tommy added quietly, his practical nature asserting itself even as his eyes lingered on the dreams spread before them. "And the renovations—" He gestured helplessly at the detailed cost estimates written in Rosa's careful script. Rosa looked up from the plans, her young face serious with the particular gravity of teenagers who understand more about family finances than they should. "Papa always says we can't afford to dream too big," she said, her voice carrying both acceptance and defiance. "But Abuela says dreams are free, even if making them real costs everything." Leo found himself thinking of the vast treasures housed within Vatican walls, the priceless artifacts and art that spoke of faith preserved across centuries, while here sat a family whose own form of sacred tradition balanced on the knife's edge of economic impossibility. "How long do you have?" Leo asked, though he dreaded the answer. Tommy and Dolores exchanged a glance, heavy with shared knowledge of harsh realities. 6 months, Tommy replied quietly. "Our lease renewal comes up in January. The landlord's already hinted he's got other plans for this building." The weight of that timeline hung in the air like incense, heavy with the scent of dreams deferred and traditions ending. Leo pushed his empty plate aside, the extraordinary meal now secondary to the extraordinary people who had prepared it with such love. He looked at each face around the table, Dolores with her fierce dignity, Tommy struggling between hope and resignation, Rosa, whose young eyes held the particular sadness of watching adults worry about things she couldn't fix. "I want to ensure that this place continues for another 3 generations, Leo said quietly, his words falling into the warm restaurant air like stones into still water. "Your lease, the expansion you've dreamed of, the renovations, I want to make all of it possible." The silence that followed was so complete that Leo could hear the soft hiss of the grill cooling down and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. Dolores's weathered hands, still resting on Rosa's shoulders, began to tremble slightly as the magnitude of his words settled over her. "Father Leo," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we couldn't possibly accept. That's..." He gestured helplessly around the restaurant, as if trying to encompass the impossibility of what he'd just heard. Rosa had gone very still, her dark eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. "You don't understand," she said carefully, her voice carrying the practical wisdom of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "The lease alone would cost more than we make in 2 years, and the renovations, the expansion, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars." Leo leaned forward, his hands folded on the red Formica table. "I understand more than you might think. I've spent my entire life in service to something larger than myself, and tonight you've reminded me what that service truly means. It's not about grand ceremonies or papal audiences. It's about preserving the places where love is made tangible, where strangers become family, where traditions pass from one generation to the next." Dolores's eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "But we're just a small restaurant," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "We're nobody special." "You fed me," Leo replied simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Not because you had to, not because protocol demanded it, but because it's who you are. You opened your door, shared your stories, welcomed me into your family, without asking for anything in return. That is everything that matters." Tommy reached across the table and covered his mother's trembling hands with his own. "Mama, this is..." He stopped, unable to voice what felt like an impossible miracle. Rosa looked between her father and grandmother, then directly at Leo. "What do you want from us in return?" "The only condition," Leo said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided millions in faith, "is that you remain exactly who you are, that you continue to treat strangers like family, that you keep your grandfather's recipes alive, that you remember that the most sacred act we can perform is to feed one another with love." As Leo rose from the booth, the family gathered around him with the tentative movements of people afraid that sudden motion might shatter a dream. Tommy had pulled out a worn leather notebook from his apron pocket, the same book where the family had sketched their impossible plans during quiet moments between customers, and he clutched it against his chest like a talisman. "I want you to know this isn't some impulse," Leo said, reaching into his simple black cassock for a plain white business card that bore only his name and a Vatican phone number. "Tomorrow morning, someone from the Vatican's administrative office will contact you. Cardinal Benedetti handles our special charitable projects. He'll work with you to make this happen properly." Dolores accepted the card with hands that shook slightly, staring at it as if it might disappear if she blinked. The simple cardstock seemed impossibly fragile to hold such enormous promise. "But how do we know?" she began, then stopped herself, clearly struggling between hope and the protective skepticism of someone who had learned that life rarely offered miracles without conditions. "You call the number," Leo said gently, his papal authority emerging through the warmth of Father Leo. "You tell Cardinal Benedetti exactly what you need, the lease terms, the renovation plans, everything you've dreamed of for this place. Then you let me worry about the details." Rosa stepped forward, her young face serious with the weight of questions that needed asking. "Father Leo, forgive me, but we need to understand. What happens if people find out? What if this becomes some big news story? We don't want to be anybody's publicity stunt." Leo smiled at her directness, appreciating the way she was already thinking like the businesswoman she would need to become. "This stays between us and God," he said simply. "The Vatican has ways of helping quietly, without fanfare. Your family's dignity will be preserved." Tommy opened his notebook, revealing pages covered with sketches and calculations, measurements and dreams written in multiple hands as different family members had contributed their hopes over the years. "We've thought about everything," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "The expanded kitchen, Rosa's catering ideas, even partnerships with local farms for fresher ingredients." Leo looked at the detailed plans spread before him, seeing not just architectural drawings, but the crystallized dreams of a family who had never stopped believing in tomorrow. "Show me everything," he said softly. "Let's make it real." The Dallas streets felt different as Leo walked back through the humid night air toward his waiting taxi, carrying with him the lingering warmth of Dolores's cornbread and the even more precious warmth of authentic human connection. The same neon signs that had seemed garish and foreign a few hours earlier now felt like beacons of ordinary life. Each storefront window a reminder of the countless families working to preserve their own small corners of hope in an uncertain world. The Martinez family had stood in the doorway of Cattleman's Pride as he departed, their silhouettes framed against the warm restaurant light, their faces glowing with the particular radiance of people whose impossible dreams had suddenly become inevitable reality. Rosa had pressed a small paper bag into his hands, leftover cornbread wrapped in wax paper, the same simple gesture that grandmothers had made for centuries, caring for others through food, even when resources were scarce. As the taxi carried him through the sprawling Texas landscape toward the airport, Leo found himself thinking not of the logistics that would need to be arranged, though Cardinal Benedetti would certainly have questions about this unprecedented expenditure, but of the look in Tommy's eyes when he realized his family's restaurant would survive. That single moment of pure joy had illuminated something fundamental that Leo had lost somewhere in the marble corridors of his papal existence. The profound satisfaction that comes from touching one life in a way that creates ripples extending far beyond the initial gesture. Father Martinez waited in the airport lounge with the patient devotion that characterized everything about the elderly priest, his weathered hands folded over the briefcase containing correspondence that suddenly seemed less urgent than it had that morning. When he spotted Leo approaching, his face brightened with relief mixed with concern. "Your Holiness," Father Martinez said softly, rising to greet him. "I trust your private prayers were fruitful?" Leo paused, feeling the weight of the question, and the careful way his secretary had avoided asking where he'd been for the past 6 hours. "More fruitful than I could have imagined, Father," he replied, settling into the seat beside the older priest. "Sometimes we find God most clearly when we step outside the places where we expect to encounter him." Father Martinez nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent decades serving the church's mysteries. As their plane lifted off into the Texas night, Leo pressed his palm against the small window, watching the lights of Dallas fade below them like earthbound stars. But instead of the familiar weight of isolation settling over his shoulders, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The lightness that comes from knowing your life has meaning beyond ceremony and protocol. Tomorrow he would return to being Pope Leo XIV, but tonight's transformation would travel with him forever. 6 months later, Leo found himself walking those same Dallas streets again, but this time his steps had a definite destination. As he turned the corner onto the street where he had first discovered Cattleman's Pride, he stopped in amazement at the transformation that greeted him. The weathered wooden sign had been lovingly restored, its gold letters gleaming warmly in the afternoon sun, but now it stretched across a facade that had doubled in width. New brickwork seamlessly blended with the original building, creating an expanded entrance flanked by the flower boxes that Rosa had drawn in her careful sketches. The sense of mesquite smoke and fresh herbs drifted from what he could see was, now, a proper outdoor patio, complete with wrought-iron tables where families shared late lunches under cheerful red umbrellas. Through the expanded windows, Leo could see the restaurant's interior glowing with warm light. The original red vinyl booths remained, but they were now accompanied by additional seating that somehow managed to maintain the intimate atmosphere while accommodating what appeared to be 3 times as many guests. A small chalkboard beside the door announced Rosa's Catering Services, authentic family recipes for your special day, in both English and Spanish, and through the window, Leo caught a glimpse of the young woman herself, now wearing a crisp white chef's coat, carefully arranging plates with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. The sound of laughter spilled from the restaurant's open door, mixed with the comfortable clatter of silverware and the gentle sizzle of meat hitting the grill. But it was the sight of Tommy moving through his expanded kitchen with obvious pride, directing a small staff with the easy authority of a man whose dreams had become reality, that made Leo's chest tighten with profound satisfaction. When Dolores spotted him through the window, her face lit up with the same radiant smile that had first welcomed him months earlier. But now there was something different in her expression, a confidence and joy that spoke of fears finally laid to rest and family traditions secured for future generations. "Father Leo," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth of old friendship, mixed with enduring gratitude. Come see what your kindness has built." As Leo stepped through the expanded entrance, he was enveloped not just by the familiar aromas of garlic and cumin, but by something more precious, the unmistakable, atmosphere of a place where love had been given room to flourish. The conversations flowing around him included voices speaking in multiple languages, construction workers from nearby sites enjoying Rosa's lunch specials, families celebrating quinceañeras in the new banquet room, elderly couples who had clearly made this their regular evening destination. Tommy emerged from behind the gleaming new counter, his face beaming with the particular pride of a man who had seen impossible dreams become inevitable reality. "Welcome home, Father," he said, embracing Leo with the warmth reserved for family. "Welcome to what you made possible." All of it testified to a simple truth that Leo had almost forgotten in the formal grandeur of Vatican life. The most sacred act was not blessing multitudes from a distant balcony, but sitting at a simple table, breaking bread with strangers who became family. In saving this small restaurant, Leo realized he had rediscovered the beating heart of his own calling, the profound joy that comes from touching lives in ways that create ripples of hope, extending far beyond any single gesture of grace.